This is an e-learning course brought to you by Contemplative Light. We are a community of spiritual teachers and writers, graciously offering our insight, experience, and most importantly, our love. We hope you enjoy your course.
Hey, and welcome to our module on Evelyn Underhill. She was born in 1875 and died in 1941. She was Anglican and very Anglo-Catholic, which, as some of you may know, is kind of high church in the Episcopal Church or Anglican Church, where, it leans towards more kind of formal services and more rituals and more of a kind of ceremonial atmosphere to it. She thought much of her life she would eventually convert to Catholicism, but never really seemed to. Her husband was a Protestant, although a fairly lukewarm Protestant, even maybe agnostic would be a better description of him. He didn't share her spiritual interests, but he did support her writings. Yet that was probably one of the major reasons she never converted to Catholicism. So she was born in 1875, and for a woman in those times in England or really anywhere, but even in England, it was very rare to be so educated. So she was extremely educated and exposed to lots of learning her whole life and throughout her life, and her parents were supportive of that. So she did get a real good education. She was born in the time, if you may remember, Victorian England or late Victorian. Around that time, it was very popular with kind of seances and psychic phenomenon and paranormal phenomenon, and that was much the rage in kind of spiritual circles. And what became her most famous work, Mysticism, that we quote often, dealt with some of those topics, as well as dealing with mysticism in the Christian tradition. And by the time she wrote Mysticism, she had pretty much combed through, just vast amounts of books on church history, theology, philosophy, the lives of the saints, the lives of all the mystics, and just was really drawing from a huge picture. She even commented on another famous book on mysticism from the early 20th century, William James, and William James' Varieties of Religious Experiences. Very much has been for a long time kind of standard reading in lots of different kinds of classes in academia, whether they're psychology of religion classes or seminary classes, but it was very much a kind of pioneering work at the time on mysticism and mystical experiences. Yet Underhill did not agree with James's take on it. She thought James was too theoretical about it and was really kind of like an armchair mystic. They'll talk about like an armchair anthropologist who, reads about all these indigenous cultures all over the world, but like never really leaves his hometown to go visit them. And that's kind of how William James was in many ways. He had not had mystical experiences himself, and yet his book has gotten a lot of attention. So in many ways, Underhill was responding to him with some of her ideas in mysticism. So some of her contrasts to William James in her book about mysticism were that mysticism was something practical, not theoretical. And in a sense, another way of saying that is it's something experiential. It's not intellectual, it's not something to it's not really necessarily something to decide by science or decide through theology based on old books. It's something practical and experiential. You experience it in the here and now, you experience it where you are, and it has a practical component of getting you closer to God and allowing you to grow deeper spiritually. So, pretty obvious things, but they needed stating at the time. And it was a purely spiritual activity for Underhill, mysticism. It was a spiritual thing, period. Sometimes James in his analyses would kind of suggest otherwise. And the business of mysticism was love for Evelyn Underhill. And her fourth main point was that mysticism did have a psychological component. So that's what she said about mysticism. And in her work, before she kind of lays down the 5 stages of mystical growth, she kind of talks about all the different other kinds of mysticism and just kinds of explores them. And I guess before that, she pretty much just defines it, direct experience of God, which is, a simple explanation, and I don't really think you need to say a whole lot more than that. So, but she elaborates on that a lot further, and as she looks at kind of things like magic, she looks at different occult circles, she looks at animism, vitalism, all these kinds of different things that are going on at the time. And she acknowledges that they're there and that something's happening, but it was almost a sense of kind of a hierarchy in a sense of how deep you were really going to go and how close you were really going to get to the truth. So for her, the ultimate goal of the mystical life was union with God, and that path of love towards the Almighty God was stronger than these other kinds of realms that were almost kind of seen as lesser forms of mysticism or distorted forms. But she didn't really necessarily say they were wrong, but she didn't necessarily say they were anything to romanticize either. It was just kind of like, she thought it was kind of like playing in the kids' pool, I guess. And, her 5 stages, which have really, I think history is beginning to look back on Underhill's work even more now and see how kind of pioneering it was, laying out the stages. And probably 100 years from now, it'll be even more so, because Western science, Western psychology, Western religion simply hasn't really done a good job in elaborating states of consciousness, what Ken Wilber would call state stages of development, or waking up. And Underhill was really kind of the first just to nail it, and just to nail some things down as far as Western religious thinkers went. Certainly there've always been some kind of schools of thought that might have been called esoteric, or just small groups or mystery schools that had all sorts of different systems, but nobody kind of really within the tradition had put forth something so clear, kind of articulating the states of consciousness you go through as you kind of wake up to the divine, as well as Underhill did. So at the beginning, she had, the first stage was awakening. And for those of you familiar with Thomas Keating, the Trappist monk, you might recall that in some of his books, he puts the first stage as simply growing up. I mean, it could really just be growing up in the church, or believing for the first time, or being confirmed or baptized or whatever, but somehow, when you just enter the life of faith. For Underhill, it wasn't really that. It was your first mystical experience, basically. Your first big mystical experience was stage one. And, now for some, that could be a conversion experience. And it doesn't have to necessarily be in some form of lightning in the sky. I mean, certainly there's lots of people, even in evangelical revivals, who, you think of Jonathan Edwards' Sinners in the Hand of an Angry God, people getting scared of going to hell and getting down on their knees, saying the sinner's prayer, asking Jesus to forgive them. And, they've got this flood of peace and light washing over them. In a sense, that's awakening right there. But Underhill generally didn't talk about it that way as much as she would talk about it in the form of something maybe a little bit more dramatic, a little bit more, a little bit more like it didn't just convert you to religion, it converted you to the realm of mysticism itself, and the realm of mystical growth itself, or you want to call it contemplative growth, or but just the idea that God can be felt in the here now, through the body you're in. So the awakening kind of converted you to that, because it was so kind of mind-blowing. In the second phase, the purgative way, very much about kind of cleansing your attachments, sins, character defects, cleaning out your system, letting go of the images and racing thoughts in your head, all that kind of thing. And it could, that's going to happen. A component of all these stages is going to happen at other stages too. So there's definitely lots of overlap here. And she doesn't get all scientific and analytical and say, well, and at that point you have officially entered stage 3. It's not really like that. It's really just kind of helpful models of talking about the progression. And in the third stage was the illuminative way, and that's kind of, there's been a huge awakening, and that's kind of made you aware of the higher consciousness, but at the same time probably unearthed a lot of kind of unconscious pain or psychological wounds, or made your attachments very clear, and there's work to do. And there's integration to do, and there's healing to do, and that's all in purgation. And then, you're kind of in an illumination where you're kind of a little bit more grounded and fully anchored in just a kind of higher consciousness all the time. Without all the kinds of contortions and sufferings and, anxieties or whatnot. In stage 2, that kind of happen after you wake up. So illumination is a bit more of a kind of leveling out of the higher state. So you're kind of carrying it around with you all the time. And then the fourth stage, and it's the stage that seems to last forever and ever and ever, the dark night of the soul. And now she calls it that, obviously, using St. John of the Cross's vocabulary, but we shouldn't necessarily mistake those for one and the same, although there's certainly plenty of analogous correspondences with it, you know, but her Dark Night should be understood in the context of, you know, the whole body of the book Mysticism. And, you know, it's really just kind of a feeling of, you know, kind of the final passage, but it can happen, it can last for a while, and it can take on all sorts of different forms, and often it's a kind of darkness and a knowing, and sometimes it's a deeper dryness, sometimes it's perhaps a deeper state, but yet all of a sudden God seems to have disappeared, and you're not really sure where God is. So, you know, it's kind of hard to describe. It's probably better to read her work, but a lot of it deals with some of the similar sufferings and absences that John of the Cross faced, and in a sense, it's kind of the final surrender of the self. I mean, ultimately, that's what's happening. It's, you know, the kind of I am, or the witness, or the deeper presence that starts to get kind of established in illumination and the beginning of the dark night. You know, and after going through the dark night, ultimately, you know, the deep inner witness kind of merges into the absolute, or another way of saying that is the indwelling spirit surrenders to God and becomes one with God, kind of fuses. So that may be the most helpful way of looking at it, that around illumination, you know, you're more fully anchored in the indwelling spirit than you are kind of in your human sinful self. You know, and perhaps awakening is the first kind of awareness of the indwelling spirit in you, which can be overwhelming and also stir up a lot of the passions of the body and mind. And purgation's getting through those. Illumination is kind of anchoring more deep in the indwelling spirit and being able to kind of be present in that state day to day. And then dark night is kind of, you know, the tremendous difficulty of moving from, you know, a kind of anchoring in the indwelling spirit to a kind of complete divine union or complete enlightenment, and that's where many mystics stay, you know, forever. Divine union's something that's probably extremely rare, but the dark night of the soul is kind of the final passage to get there. And yet again, as I've said, these stages aren't necessarily in order, and there's aspects of each one and the others, and so on. And that's probably makes it a good thing that Underhill wrote this book just using the descriptions of other mystics throughout history. So that's a lot on her work. And believe it or not, she had a whole lot of other books as well. But that's her main book that has kind of become essential for Christian mysticism. But she wrote a lot of other books, including one on the Eucharist, you know, one on worship. She had one on John von Risbroek, just him alone. If you've seen my module on that, you know, she talks about the sparkling stone in that book a lot too. And yeah, never got around to joining the Catholic Church, but became very well known in the Anglican Church, became very well sought after spiritual director, radio lecturer, writer, you know, gave sermons, you know, everything. I mean, she was very, very highly regarded, you know, in her day. So, and history will probably even elevate her more and more as time goes on. So that's Evelyn Underhill. A lot to say about her, but you know, she did so much in terms of her work that that really it's one of those things where you could spend your lifetime just studying her work and gain a tremendous amount from it. So hope you enjoyed this module, and God bless. We'll see you on the next one.
This concludes our course. To learn more, please visit our website at www.contemplativelight.com. We look forward to seeing you again soon.